Hi everyone, this is Mr. Robotic Warfare, and today I'm going to be doing a deep dive on the device that you see right behind me here. So this device was recently featured in an episode of Ilmango's Skyblock series. Right now he's doing a playthrough of Skyblock where he's using an additional mod that adds some features to the game that are not normally in vanilla. One of those features is the ability to convert vexes to allays by playing a specific sequence of 5 Noteblock notes, which is a super clever mechanic, and I think it should be in vanilla. But regardless, in his most recent episode, he builds a device that does this conversion process completely automatically. It spawns the vexes, captures them, converts them, and then stores them for later use. That episode is linked below in the description. I highly recommend that you watch that video first. But regardless, I was very, very lucky to be able to help him out in building this by supplying this portion of the machine right here, which is the part that's actually responsible for doing the conversion of the vexes into the allays. So you can see here, we send a vex into the machine, we play a sequence of Noteblock notes, and then we have an allay that comes out. So Mango already does a fantastic job of explaining how this device works in his video, but in the style of the rest of that video, I wanted to give my thoughts on how I designed the device, how my building process works, and just a little bit of a deeper dive into the mechanics of how this is actually working. So just for starters, when you have a vex in a minecart and you have it on a detector rail, you can use a comparator to get a signal strength output from that detector rail. And with a vex in a minecart, that signal strength is going to be somewhere between 0 and 11, which is meant to correspond to Noteblock notes 0 to 11. So when you tune a Noteblock, you tune it to a specific note by right-clicking, and if you look over on the right-hand side of my screen there above the red false, you see it says note 0, and I've tuned each of these sequentially, so note 1, note 2, note 3, all the way up to note 11. And what we want to do is we want to use this output from the device because the vex is essentially telling us what the next note it wants to hear is to convert it into an allay. So we need to play 5 notes in quick succession, and we need to do this before the vex despawns, and we need to not play any incorrect notes because that will reset the sequence back to the first note. And notably, the sequence of notes that's required is completely randomized. It's different for every single vex. So we can't just play the same tune over and over again. We need to actually intelligently detect what note the vex requires and then play it. So essentially what we need is we need a device that takes a signal strength between 0 and 11 and plays the correct sequence of Noteblock notes. So the first thing that you might think is, okay, well, if we have some kind of signal strength emanating from a comparator, all we want to do is we want to just put a Noteblock there and at the correct signal strength, and it'll play it. Well, the problem with that is that if we do this, we'll play a Noteblock note, but any other notes that we have will also play. So what we want is we want a way to only play one individual Noteblock at a time. And if we take a step back and we generalize this, what we essentially are trying to build here is a device that takes a signal strength and converts it to a single output for each individual signal strength. Stated in a more technical way, what we're looking to build is a signal strength to unary decoder. And this is common enough in Minecraft builds that the community has actually given this kind of device a name, which is a Redcoder. So what we want to do is we want to build a Redcoder, essentially, that gives you a unique output for each individual signal strength input, and those outputs are meant to be mutually exclusive. So only one output plays, and that output is directly corresponding to the signal strength of the input. So signal strength obviously goes up to 15, and if we just have a signal strength of 15, it's going to travel all the way down the redstone until it runs out. But if we wanted to have only one of these Noteblock on at a time, what we can do instead is we can invert it and use torches. Because if the Noteblock is consistently powered, even if it turns off and turns on again, it'll still play its note. Just like that. So the idea is if we invert this, now we are using torches turning off and on instead of just redstone turning on by itself. What this lets us do is essentially pick a torch to power by powering the redstone on top of all of the other blocks. So essentially what we want to do is we want to turn all of the other torches off except for one at a time. And the way that we can do this is by powering this line asymmetrically. What I mean by that is that we power this redstone line from both ends, but we only power it with a signal strength high enough to power all of the other redstone dust except for the one on top of the torch that we want to actually play. So if I have a couple of different note blocks here and we tune them differently, if we play this right now, we're playing all of those notes at the same time. But what we can do is we can add a signal strength level that's less than 15, and we can gradually get it so that we are only playing this device. So if we were to trigger this now, we only have one note playing. But we're obviously going to have other note blocks on either side of this because we need a total of 12. As a reminder that Vex is going to output a signal strength somewhere between 0 and 11. So we need 12 total note blocks, and we only want one to turn on. So what we can do is we can power it just enough so that all of the other ones on this side of the torch, or excuse me, on this side of the note block that we want to play are turned off. And we can do the same thing on the other side. I don't know exactly how many I'm going to need here. Perfect. So that on the other side, we're powering it just up to the point, but not including the note that we want to play. So now if we play this, we're only getting the note that we want. And we can further modify this by then, if we change the signal strength a little bit, we can take some out of this side and put some on this side. And by dynamically changing the strength of the signals on either side, we are now selecting an individual output that will now play a different note, just like that. So this is the concept behind how this is meant to work. Now, what we can do is, instead of trying to power it with different things on either end, we can just use a single block and loop it around itself by using a comparator in subtract mode. So if we were to just place something in this item frame right here and spin it upright, we now have the signal strength of 1, which you can again see on the right-hand side there. It says power 1. We have a signal strength of 1 that's actually coming out of this comparator now through the signal, through the item frame here. And if we put this in subtract mode, what we can do is we can then kind of pseudo invert that signal and get something that is a subtraction of that. So if you see here, we have a signal strength of 14 and a signal strength of 1. So at any given time, these two lines are going to add up to 15. So if we were to switch this to 2 now, you can see that it's 2 and 13, or 3 and 12, etc., etc. So now what we're doing is we're essentially creating the same kind of paradigm, but we're using it by powering only one side. And then what we do is, if we loop this around, like so, we can get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15 right here. So if we go ahead and repopulate with torches, we now have 15 torches, and at any given time, we're only going to have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. We're only have one of these torches on at a time. So if we have this set to signal strength of 1, the idea is what we would want to do is have only one of these torches on, but powering it on either side. Now, this is not working right now, and that's an important thing to note, because what's happening is if we sum it to 15, we're powering, we essentially want this torch to be on right now because it's supposed to be a signal strength of 1. This is the 0 signal, this is the 1 signal. Now what's happening is that right here to the other side we have a power of 2, which means we have a power of 1 right here. So this is actually off by 1. We have 1 signal strength level too many just by doing it by a torch here. So what we actually want to do to make sure that this works correctly is have the signal strength on one side and 15 minus the signal strength minus 1 on the other side to ensure that the exact torch that's powered on is what we have. So instead of using a torch, we can just use a mostly full device of some kind. And there, now the maximum signal strength that we're outputting here is 14, which means that when we subtract it, we only have one torch on at a time. So you can see now, if I spin this item frame, you can see that torch spinning right around there, just like that. And if we were to remove it, we get a signal strength of 0, and that torch turns on as well. So fantastic. We have built a kind of Redcoder here to only power one torch at a time, and we can actually surround this with note blocks here. Let's just do it like this. And just quickly tune them. And if we add this back here, you can just hear. Just like that. So this is essentially exactly what we want. Now, there are two edge case considerations that we need to take into account when we're actually building this machine. The first is that an array could actually want a signal strength of 0, which means that if we have a 0 torch, we're covered. But the other thing is that we need to handle the case where 0 is the first note that the Vex wants to hear. Because if we just have like a detector rail sitting on top here, and then we have like a comparator coming out of that, obviously if we were to scooch this down by 1, and if we were to have the minecart with the Vex come onto here, this would not just be enough to start the process, because if the very first note is a 0, then you're not really going to have any subsequent change because this torch is just going to stay on. In a similar sense, if you have a Vex that requires 2 consecutive notes of the same pitch, then again, you're going to have this issue where nothing is changing. So if we have, let's just say, for example, a signal strength of 2, or note 2 is the thing that we want to play here. If the sequence of 5 notes anywhere includes 2 note 2s in a row, then we're going to be out of luck because there's not actually anything changing with the system. So a Redcoder by itself is not enough. Now, if we wander back over here, what you saw when I was actually demonstrating this is I was pulling this lever right here. And that's actually what's causing it to play the note. Now, why does this work? Because essentially what I'm doing is I am sending a signal strength that is so high that it powers all of the torches in the line, so that when I turn it off, we're going to have the signal strength that's still here. We've essentially overridden it, but when we remove that override, we return right to the exact signal strength that we have here. So if this was the setup over here, and we're just trying to play this individual note, what I can do is I can turn this on and off and essentially flood the entire the entire line. And if we have the same signal strength that's happening here, we can essentially play the same pitch multiple times. This actually also helps us in the case where we are trying to play a 0 note, which might be represented by something like this, where we have the very furthest one here, and this still works under the same principle, because if we're turning this on and off and flooding the entire line, this signal strength can stay the same and we can play the same note multiple times. So to achieve this, what we essentially want to do is we want to connect a clock to this line that repeatedly overpowers the entire line and turns all the torches off, so that an individual torch can be turned on each time when the clock is cycling low. So a really, really simple way of building a clock here is just to use another comparator in subtract mode, and just when you give it an input, it's going to power this line fully, right? It's 15. The signal strength doesn't really actually matter here. But what happens is that when you have this signal strength here, it's going to loop back around into this repeater, which is then going to provide 2 game ticks of delay, and then resubtract it from that original signal, and then you get 0. And then after a delay, the repeater turns off, it turns back on, and you get the cycle that you see here. You can also extend this by making the repeater longer and longer, and you can kind of tune your clock here. But we want this to work as fast as possible. So if we set it on a 1-tick repeater, then we get essentially the fastest clock possible. And we can disable this clock at any time by removing the input to the comparator, so we can just basically have a clock going whenever we want. And what happens is if we attach a torch to this in such a way that it would power that entire line, we now get a torch that is going to essentially do what we want. Oh, wait. You can see what just happened here is that if you pulse a torch too quickly for too long, it'll actually burn out. And you see it'll take a while before it recognizes that it is unburned out. You can either update it or do something like that, but you can see we got all these weird edge cases where if we're pulsing it this quickly, we run into some issues. The lucky thing about this situation is that if we only want to play 5 nodes, if we time this correctly, we can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and shut it off, and everything will be fine. So because we're only trying to play 5 nodes, if we're very careful about the timing of this device, we can do this as quickly as possible without burning out the torch. The last thing that we need to consider here before we try and build up the whole device is the delay that it actually takes for comparators to update when a signal strength changes. So if we were to have a Vex and a minecart here, and we have some signal strength coming out, let's say that it's 5, and we play the corresponding 5 node, it's going to take some time for that comparator to detect the fact that the Vex has changed its preference. So the Vex will change pretty much instantly, but it's going to take the comparator a moment to actually detect the fact that that signal strength has changed. And we can actually get around this by forcibly updating the comparator every single tick, every single game tick, instead of waiting for its natural cooldown. And at this point, we're just going to wander over to the full device and show you how that's done here. So the way that we do this is next to this comparator. First of all, you can see that we've got the same setup here. We've got the comparator coming out of the detector rail, going into one feed through comparator and one subtraction comparator. We're using a reduced number here, and because we only need 12 note blocks, not the full 15, we're using a circuit with only 12 here, which means that the maximum signal strength that we want to be able to output is 11, so that by default it reaches all the way around except for this one. But to forcibly update this comparator, the way that you do that is you can have a chest right here with some kind of block in it. For this instance, we just have a block of redstone. And beneath that chest, you have a hopper with all dissimilar items than the one in the chest. So what's essentially happening here is that every single tick, this hopper is checking if it's empty, and if not, if it can pull this this item out of the chest here. Obviously it can't because it's blocked, but because of the way that this is set up, the game fundamentally checks this every single tick, and that actually supplies an update to a comparator that's next to it, which means essentially what we're doing is we're forcing this comparator to update its state every single tick. So when we combine all of these concepts together, what we get is a Redcoder that's hooked up to note blocks that are tuned from 0 to 11. We're playing one of those individually by changing which individual piece of redstone dust is turned off at any time. And below this, what we're doing is we are activating a clock, which is that same thing that you saw earlier. We're activating a clock to pulse that torch 5 times. The torch is over here by, the torch is over here, by the way. It's right in the center here, so it's powering everything at the same time. You can see that we've got a signal strength of 15 here, which reaches all the way around. So when we have a clock, we're turning this off to essentially lock in the value that's right here from the Vex and play that individual note. Then the clock cycles, and when it disables again, this will have changed thanks to our Comparator Updater, and we're going to play the next note, and then the next note, and the next note, and we're going to do this exactly 5 times to prevent this torch from burning out. So the question is then, how do we activate the clock, and then how do we make sure that we're only playing this 5 times? Well, when we have a minecart sitting on top of here, we're having it blocked by the fence gate, and we can simply open the fence gate at the correct moment to have the minecart travel off of the detector rail. So you can see that's exactly what happens here. We have this observer that moves up, opens the fence gate, and allows the delay to continue before it continues sitting on. If you have a Vex that gets converted in the minecart and it just stays on the detector rail, we can just demonstrate that for a second. It's just going to keep playing the 0 note because essentially there's no note to be played. We can just let that guy go on instead. But essentially what's happening is that it will just continue showing a signal strength of 0, which in this case is not ideal because, as you heard, we did in fact burn out our torch over here. Obviously updated again because we fixed it, But that's kind of the system that we've set up here. So the question is, we need to trigger this at the correct moment so that we don't burn it out. We can do this by this, this piston observer thing, essentially opening this fence to get the cart off of the rail here. The other question is, how do we keep the clock going? And for the same reason that I described earlier about needing to be able to play the 0 signal strength, instead of using the output from the comparator here, we're actually using the default output of the detector rail below it. So when there's a cart on this, that redstone dust is going to be powered regardless of what's inside it, because there's a minecart on top of it, and we're essentially using that output to then power our clock. So then we can actually take an output from here, and we can do the same thing. We have some delay, and after some delay, we can then raise this piston up at the exact moment to open the fence, right before that last note plays, so you can actually see that the minecart is traveling off of the detector rail before that 5th note plays. So listen carefully. So you can see that we actually trigger this before the 5th note has played, so that the delay is being converted somewhere over here when it's already off of the detector rail, so that we can continue this. And obviously, if we grab a redstone block here, you can see that we continue cycling this. There's just an item traveling around in there, which allows us for this throughput here, because this device is essentially resetting itself and is ready for each subsequent Vex. Now, the only other clever technical thing that I'll get into is the way that these repeaters are set up here. So essentially, we want to take an output from here, and after some delay, put it into this piston right here. Now, I wanted to try and make this as space efficient as possible for Mango, and that means that there's not really a huge amount of space. We could actually pull repeaters off of this way, excuse me. But we've already got a little bit of space over here. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually taking that output from the clock here, and I'm using a special fact of repeaters where if you have a string of repeaters in a row, one with 1 tick and one with 4 ticks, you can actually see here that even though this repeater is turning on and off, this one just stays consistently powered. So we are essentially rectifying the clock signal back into a continuous signal. And we do this by having all of these 3 repeaters in a line here. So that saves a little bit of space by using this mechanic of repeaters to essentially rectify that redstone signal and then put it back into the piston here. So that is a quick walkthrough of how this device works and kind of my concept behind how I designed it. If you have any questions or further considerations about this, feel free to let me know in the comments. But other than that, that's all I've got for you. So thank you so much, and I'll see you later.